So we saw with price controls that we're going to restrict the quantity, and the result is we must get at least this amount of dead weight loss. But this is as far as the math will carry itself. At this point, it's us as economists to think through the problem and to think what else can happen. So I'll tell a more elaborate story about all this in a second, but let me start with what we've got. If we've got, let's say, a price floor that's too high, we're only going to have a small number of buyers, right? So that's going to restrict the total benefits that we get in this market. And if we happen to get the highest benefit usage of this limited number and the lowest cost provision for this limited number, then compared to our maximal total surplus, we miss out on this. So the math of it is pretty straightforward. It's just another geometry triangle problem. We find this height, we find this width, and we do base times height times 1/2. Right? So if this number is m and this number is x, m minus x times delta q, which we went through in a previous video, times 1/2. Now that's the math of it, but the interpretation takes more. So let's start with the example of the ceiling. So this is a low price. This is like Black Friday. And when Black Friday is happening, the prices are too low. And that means quantity demanded outstrips the limited amount there, which means now these buyers are competing with each other, right? It's no longer a situation of you can go to the store and you can buy it if you want, right? If you go into Target looking to buy a can of Ovaltine, you don't have to beat up some little old lady to make sure that you get it, because quantity supplied is there to match the quantity demanded at that price. But if we have this price being too low, now we have more people who want to buy it. Right? So how are they going to compete with each other? Well, the standard way to do this in a relatively civilized society is to wait in line. Right? So they could fight, but they could just wait in line. Let's make a simplifying assumption here. I'm going to switch to a light color. So m minus x, whatever this gap is, this is telling us basically the bonus consumer surplus that's sort of at stake for these buyers if they are going to be the ones who get it by waiting in line long enough. All right, so let's say that for a typical one of these buyers, this amount at stake is like $100. So $100 for that buyer means that they're willing to wait in line using up $100 of opportunity cost if they're guaranteed. Right? Here's an expected value question. Would you be willing to wait 12 hours in line if you thought you had a 50% chance of getting this really cheap TV? So if your total consumer surplus is, let's just say $120, and your value of your time is $10 an hour, 12 hours in line, that's $120 loss for you. You would be breaking even if you got the TV. If there's only a 50% chance that you get the TV, you shouldn't be willing to wait in line longer than 6 hours, as long as you're still getting that 50% chance waiting 6 hours. So you're willing to wait in line for a long time. How long do you have to wait? Well, you have to wait long enough that whoever is the next buyer, that marginal buyer, the person you just need to leave the line to ensure that you're the one who gets it, you need to wait long enough that their opportunity cost of their time is high enough that they're not willing to wait for maybe $90 of sort of bonus value. If you are willing to basically outbid them in terms of how much time you are willing to give up to nobody's benefit, then you can guarantee that you get the TV. But the result is now you face a cost in order to get this benefit. So what does that mean? Well, if you wait the full amount of time, and if everyone on this portion of the demand curve waits, we can dissipate the gains. We dissipate all the benefits of that low price, And now your cost of getting this cheap TV is X dollars plus M minus X dollars worth of time. So you are M dollars poorer, X dollars dollar poorer, but M dollars plus time poorer. So you are worse off as a buyer with this price ceiling than you would be if the price was higher. And these other buyers didn't get to buy at all. Right? So this is a really bad case scenario where the few people who are able to get this good waste an enormous amount of time to get there. This video is short. I've got time to do another version of this. So in the case of a price floor that is too high, the classic example is the Civil Aeronautics Board. So back before Jimmy Carter deregulated the airline industry, of course the airline industry is still regulated, but under Jimmy Carter's administration, the Civil Aeronautics Board came to an end, and that was basically a regulatory oversight board that kept prices high for interstate travel. People have looked at this and they compared, say, the price of a flight between LA and San Francisco with a flight between San Francisco and Las Vegas. Those are similar distances, but one crosses state lines and was subject to the Civil Aeronautics Board. And I think, if memory serves, and it probably doesn't, I think they said basically the price is doubled. So that effectively means that interstate travel kind of had a price above the competitive equilibrium. So what is the impact that we get from that? Well, we expect to get some dead weight loss, right? We expect to get this restricted quantity. We have, some benefit from some high value customers. People are willing to spend big bucks to fly from New York to LA, but not people going on vacation, right? So we're still getting the highest benefit consumers, but what about the costs of the sellers? Well, maybe you just happen to have the lowest costs and happen to get these people to buy from you. But if you're this seller here and you're about to go bankrupt, what do you do to make sure that the buyer buys from you instead of this guy over here? Well, you add amenities. You make your airline nicer. You treat your customers like human beings, which is not something that happens in the competitive equilibrium. You serve food. You have charming and fun flight attendants instead of grizzled, old, tired, angry, retired postal workers. You add extra features, and those extra features are going to increase the demand curve. Now, this comes back to something we talked about in an earlier video, which is thinking about shifting curves. So if we add amenities, we are going to increase the value of a ticket on our airline. And we're closing this gap, right? We are starting to resolve this problem that we faced with this high regulated price that was above the market clearing level. So the norms increase, better customer service, more legroom. I mean, you might as well have more legroom. You don't have flyers. Why have empty seats? Take some seats out, get some legroom. Get more comfortable seats. Add these features. That's going to increase demand for your flights, but it's also going to increase your costs. So at that higher price, you can't afford to sell this many tickets anymore. But hey, we found a spot where now we are in equilibrium. Now, this might also explain the story that we see with minimum wage. With minimum wage, we have a minimum legal price, and we worry that we would have this big gap between the quantity of people selling their time and the amount of people buying people's time. Employers hiring workers and workers selling their time. Well, part of what happens with a minimum wage is that we're going to see different sorts of workers, maybe more reliable workers, workers who can demonstrate that they are going to show up on time because maybe they have a car and they don't have to take the bus into work. Maybe people who have more work experience are going to be more willing to work for what would have been an $8 an hour job, but at $12 an hour, we've got more people willing to join the quantity supplied for this particular job, right? So we're going to have two sorts of problems in that case. One is this problem that we're seeing here, where we're adding costs, and those costs could outweigh our benefits. And then the other problem is that, I'm looking for that allocation problem. So we saw with the price ceiling, if the ambulances get the gas, that's great. If I get the gas and run my generator to play video games while people die because an ambulance can't get to them, that is inefficient, to put it mildly. In this case, we could think about if you're, say, looking for someone to mow your lawn. There's a high school kid down the street trying to save money so he can go to college. He's got a really low opportunity cost because high school kids don't know anything that anyone cares about, but they can push around a lawnmower. So it makes sense to try and hire that kid. But if you're required to pay $50 an hour to get someone to mow your lawn, well, maybe you don't hire an amateur. Maybe you hire someone with a shiny new piece of equipment who's going to guarantee they're going to get all their leaves. Maybe you hire someone who puts a lot of effort into marketing instead of just wandering around knocking on doors. And then you get the problem of getting the same good from a higher cost provider instead of a lower cost provider. But I'm throwing too many things out all at once right now. Let's ground ourselves. What have we got? So starting with the price ceiling, we've got this situation where too many people want to buy relative to how much is available to sell. One possibility is that the people who want it the most just start lining up and they wait longer than everyone. So they sacrifice a bunch of time to guarantee that they get this nice product that is underpriced. In that case, our dead weight loss is this enormous area. It's much bigger than the math alone tells us. Another possibility would be that maybe randomly people get this product, right? So maybe this guy gets it randomly, maybe this lady gets it, maybe this person over here gets it. And the result of something like that is that now we're going to kind of smush the demand curve in. Right? Or if there was a particular part of the demand curve that was more likely, right, maybe we could kind of smudge that a little bit. I'm going to do this with pen, right? If the top part is more likely to get it, then we could expand this out a little bit and kind of slope this down more. On the other hand, if the people down here are more likely to get it than the people up here, then we could have something that looks more like this. And all of these lines are just representing a mix of different people from along this line getting some benefit from this product. So this person gets it, their benefit is over here, and we're missing out on all this stuff up here. All right, so that is a lot of how to think about the dead weight loss that we might expect to get from a price ceiling. From a price floor, we were starting to tell a story, and we ended up telling a slightly different story, kind of related to this story. So that story is, again, a misallocation where we're getting the wrong part of the supply curve selling at this high price floor. So maybe this really costly seller is selling, and the equivalent is now our total surplus is this smaller triangle up here, instead of this bigger trapezoid it could have been, right? Or maybe whoever's going to be able to sell, maybe these people are the ones who are going to sell, but they have to invest so much in marketing, so much in going door to door, knocking to see, will you pay this inflated price to mow your lawn? They spend so much effort that their costs are artificially higher, and so they eat up a lot of that producer surplus. So the line or the marketing costs, this is another behavior that erodes that total surplus as a result of this price control. This random allocation, that misallocation story, is one where some of the people who are either low valued buyers or high cost sellers happen to be the ones who are actually making the transactions, instead of strictly between the highest benefit and the lowest cost, right? Once we start to bring in the wrong part of the supply curve and the wrong part of the demand curve, our benefits are no longer this full trapezoid. We start to squeeze that in. Now let's come back to this more elaborate story. So where were we? We had the Civil Aeronautics Board adding features. These features increased the benefit of flying, but they also added costs. So can we predict what's going to happen? Well, we can certainly expect that we're going to go up to this higher price. We're going to shift our equilibrium price to match our legislated minimum legal price, our price floor. And really cool thing, we close that gap, so we get rid of our excess supply. We no longer have a price floor that results in people offering a lot more than people want to buy. We've coordinated buyers and sellers' desires so that QD equals QS. That sounds really good, right? That is at the very least a harmonious equilibrium where nobody wants to change what they're doing. And this is really an important point. The sort of naive textbook story of we have a, say, increased minimum wage, and it leads to a ton of unemployment. That logic is there, but to the extent we can shift these curves, that logic doesn't stick around, right? That big unemployment gap is not an equilibrium if workers can engage in costly behavior to make themselves more attractive to employers. So either we're thinking about you do extra stuff to make your job application look good to get a minimum wage job. What does that do to your costs versus how attractive you are to employers? Or we think about the Civil Aeronautics Board. Airlines are adding amenities, but that costs them something. The way I drew this is I basically modeled this as the per unit cost of an airline ticket has gone up by some amount. I'm going to find that amount relative to the competitive equilibrium price, just to have a fixed point that makes it really easy to compare what's happening to the benefit. So we've got that, and we've got that gap. Let me find my red and my light blue. Here we have the increase in benefits, and here we have the increase in costs. Right? On a per unit basis, we would multiply by the quantity to find what is the total change in costs and benefits, and that's going to be a little bit of a mess in terms of setup, but that's also good practice. So I'm not going to do that just yet. But what have I shown here? I've drawn this with the change in costs higher than the change in benefits. Now, why would I do that? This is, again, me playing economist rather than mathematician. So I'm going to use the math to tell the story, but my sense of economics is going to determine what that story is. So let's imagine the alternative. In the alternative, we shift supply, but we shift demand even more. Right? So we start here, we end here. Right? In this case, we start here, we end here. We move up and to the left instead of up and to the right. In both cases, we're definitely increasing price. Right? So given this too high price, it makes sense to do things that increase demand or decrease supply, or both, right? That's going to close that gap, right? We certainly wouldn't want to do things that decrease demand, because that's just going to ameliorate this gap, which means that suppliers have all the more reason to try and do weird stuff. So why do we get here instead of here? Why is it that the costs exceed the benefits? Well, if we had a situation like this, where we have some change we can make that increases costs a little bit, but increases benefits even more. So let's imagine, say, in 2020, on his way out the door, some federal regulator just strikes some safety laws and says, you know what, Airbags, they're not required anymore. We can get by without airbags. Would a manufacturer voluntarily save money on airbags by removing them from their cars? Well, they would save some costs, but they would also lose some business. And the question is it worth it? And almost certainly the answer is no, right? Not in 2020. You would immediately get fired if you're the executive who starts doing this. Even if it's legal, you're taking away something that your customers want, so you're going to lose customers, right? If we go in the opposite direction of our Civil Aeronautics Board story, right? If we're going in this direction, you are losing business. You're cutting costs, but because your customers are so upset, you end up with fewer of them. So what happens to your producer surplus? It goes from this triangle up here to this triangle down here. Now, I just assumed a parallel shift. That's going to make the analysis a little bit easier. So given that parallel shift, we have saved these costs, but we've lost even more benefits. But just for the seller alone, what's going on? Well, here we are. All right, here are the costs we would save if there was no change in our equilibrium quantity. Let me set that in a different color just to make it that much clearer. Right, we get this parallelogram. But if demand shifts more than that, then we aren't going to actually get there. We're going to get to here. So we're getting that savings, right? So let's say it's $10 for an airbag times, 800,000 customers compared to 1,000 before, right? So we're saving $800. We're actually saving a little bit more because we don't have to produce those last 200 cars. But our revenue was high enough to justify those expenses. We were getting producer surplus here. So we are losing from this side, right? We're saving some money. We're losing some money there. All of this said, this is getting a little bit messy. Long story short, it would be profitable to add these amenities without a minimum price. Taking them away is a bad idea if it means that you're going to be losing business. In fact, we actually saw exactly this sort of shift. When we got rid of that minimum price, we saw airlines like Southwest come onto the scene and really thrive, selling cheap tickets with less amenities to many more people. Many more people fly after the end of the Civil Aeronautics Board. So it fits with my intuition that we would in fact see, with that minimum price, relative to where we could have been without it, a higher price but a lower quantity, because taking away those amenities saves enough on costs that even though customers are less happy, we're actually growing the size of that market. All right, so what can we do with this? What sort of math can we do on this scenario? Well, we can ask questions about how big are the shifts in costs and benefits and how much of them go to producers and suppliers, but we're already almost at 25 minutes, so I'm not going to do that here.